Hello, my friends. Hello, my friends. Are you my friends?
Yeah.
Are you really my friends? Can we be friends? No? Is it possible? What's a friend? Holy moly, it's been ages since I've read this. Ages. It's been like years and years since I've read the chapters on friendship. Haven't taught it in this class before. This semester I was like, we're doing those books on friendship at the end of Nick Ethics. And I couldn't be happier. What a delightful couple of books. The mere fact that he decides in the middle of the ethics to devote 2 whole books to the idea of friendship is the sort of thing that warms the heart. I gotta say, there's something about Aristotle and virtue ethics in general that just, I don't know. It's like when he talks about, do you guys get this impression too? Maybe you just don't buy into the reading as much as I do. When he talks about courage, I feel my spine stiffen a little bit. Like I stand up a little straighter when Aristotle talks about virtue, and I find myself talking about virtue. Same thing's going on here with friendship. I talk all the time, very casually, about friends. I don't know how often I think very carefully about what it means. And the more that I do, I don't know. Makes me want to be a better friend. Which raises all these questions about, like, what does it take to be a good friend, right? Obviously. And that's what Aristotle's out to establish, I suppose. Before we get to that, let's do a little bit of catch-up, because we've talked about some stuff already. We've done books 1 through 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Book 1 was all about happiness and moral virtue, right? Happiness and arete. Where happiness is eudaimonia, right? We talked about it as an activity, where virtue is this thing that's like, it's a more potential activity. It's this kind of holding back. These are the conditions that you need in order to live a good, flourishing life. Then in Book 2, we talked about moral virtues, specifically these virtues that have to do with the taming, perhaps, if you want to use that kind of language, the taming of the irrational soul by the rational soul. This kind of way that the rational soul manages to take charge of and order and organize those parts of the soul that can be ordered and organized. That's not all of the human soul, by the way. There are parts of the human soul that you just can't do anything about. Those are mostly vegetative aspects of your soul. They're things that belong to the human soul by nature, in the sense that they can't be changed. But there are other things that can be changed. And these are moral virtues, or character, right? It's the building of moral character is what he's talking about. We get a kind of a theoretical apparatus for trying to zero in on exactly what these virtues are, because we could imagine if we said, like, yeah, virtue is important. What is virtue? We can imagine like all these menotypes that'll come and be like, there are lots of virtues, right? And we could kind of just like spiral all around trying to figure out what these virtues are. But Aristotle, kind of like Socrates and Meno, kind of like Plato does, zeroes in on a couple where he's like, these are definitely going to be important virtues. He talks about courage, he talks about temperance, he talks about a couple of other virtues. And he gives us this mechanism, the doctrine of the mean, wherein we see every virtue as a mean between 2 extremes. There are always going to be 2 vices, at least 2 vices, describable in many ways, that involve the missing of the virtuous mean. For courage, what were the 2 vices again? Remind me. Cowardice, that's the easy one. And recklessness or rashness, yeah, that's the other one, right? So we can, and depending on how you think about these things, one can be the excessive vice, the other one can be the deficient vice, or you could flip it around if you needed to. What about temperance? Temperance is the virtue with respect to... Close. He makes a separate conversation about self-control specifically. But yeah, if courage is about fear, temperance is about... Kate? Desire, yeah. Temperance is about desire. And you can have an excess of desire or a deficiency of desire. You can have an excess of, like, I guess, kind of constitutional will against desire. You can have a deficiency of that constitutional will against desire that kind of gets you to not just go immediately after the things that you desire, that involve things like self-control. Although self-control isn't exactly what we're talking about. It's this taming of desire, right? He's not talking about a strengthening of the will necessarily. He's talking about shaping desire. And this includes things like desiring the right things, just like courage involves fearing the right things. These are complex, but this doctrine of the mean gives us a way of kind of zeroing in on exactly what we mean for virtue. And this is surprisingly, from my own experience at least, this is surprisingly useful. Even though we haven't pinned virtue down with a Socratic definition necessarily, we've definitely got a roadmap for getting to it. And one of the things that Aristotle begins to like get into in some of these later books is he begins to kind of like develop this idea that the insight into what virtue is, into like figuring out exactly what is courageous, those weird muddy cases where you're kind of like, was that courage or was that recklessness? I'm not really sure. He made it, or she made it. She didn't die in the process of this fearless act, but kind of seemed like it was just luck that they didn't die. I'm not really sure. Are those courage, those moments? Are they fear? Are they recklessness? It's tough to tell. Well, Aristotle says the closer you get to virtue, the more discerning your eye gets with respect to these things, right? You become like a better discriminator between the finer points of virtue and vice. And that seems like it makes sense, at least if we're thinking about this in the context of any other sort of expertise that's developed. The more expertise you develop, the more jazz you listen to, the more you're going to be able to like pick out subtle differences between jazz tunes, right? Or between styles. And perhaps I don't see why this wouldn't be the same with virtue. In Book 3, we get into responsibility and choice and a concentrated treatment of courage and temperance. In Book 4, we get a whole bunch of more virtues. He just kind of throws a whole bunch of them out. It says, like, here's a virtue, here's a virtue, here's a virtue. Describes their excessive and deficient vices. And kind of sketches out this picture of, like, moral character. In this, we get, and this came up as a question in one of our classes, somebody asked this question about whether or not Aristotle's version of virtue seems a little too selfish. It's all about making sure that I flourish, not necessarily making sure that other people flourish. Well, a lot of the virtues that get discussed here in Book 4 are clearly virtues that have to do with pro-social characteristics. Things like being charitable, right? And he describes this as a mean between two extremes. You can be dissolute, you can be wasteful, you can be profligate, but you could also be too stingy. And the charitable person strikes the right balance. In Book 5, just in case you weren't sure whether or not an Aristotelian virtuous person is a selfish person or a selfless person, or like could they be a good citizen, he talks about justice as like possibly one of the most important virtues, and one that's kind of poorly understood, mostly because there's this confusion as to whether or not when we talk about justice, are we talking about justice within the individual soul, or are we talking about justice within the community? Is justice something that happens in the city, or is justice something that happens in a citizen? And he entered either justice is, of course, said in many ways, and he says, if we're talking about it at the level of the citizen, it seems like it's whole virtue. It's this way of bringing all the virtues together. Did we talk about this, by the way? We did not talk about this. Virtue holism. I'm never sure whether that's with an H or a W. Basically, what we mean is virtue is a holistic sort of a thing. You can't be virtuous in any one respect without being virtuous in all the respects. Does that make sense? It seems hard. It's starting to set the bar really high for virtue, maybe impossibly high, in this way that no actual people actually become, capital V, virtuous. But we're always kind of like aiming at it, trying to get to it. But perhaps this does make sense. In order to be courageous, do you have to be temperate? Where are the moments where, like, you fall down with respect to fear? Could you fall down with respect to fear because you're too attached to something and you're worried that it'll be taken away? It's an excessive desire and losing the object of your desire that you fear? And now this could, like, perhaps lead to moments of cowardice? Can you be honest without being courageous? Because if you don't have the courage to stand up in the face of, like, scary things that need to be faced down, isn't it possible that someday, like, you'll lie because it's scarier to tell the truth? Are these most of your lies? These are most of my lies. It's scarier to tell the truth than it is in some moments. It's scarier to tell the truth than it is to, like, tell a lie and make things easier. Or perhaps this is about temperance. And I like the way that things are and I don't want them to change, and that's why I tell the lie. So both courage and temperance seem to be required for honesty as well. Friendliness, if this is a virtue, we're going to get into friendship. But can you be friendly without being honest? Can you be honest without being... Can you be friendly without being honest? What's that? We can get into the motivation behind the friendship? Yeah.
That's not really friendship, though.
It's not really friendship if it's not honest?
Aristotle doesn't
He says friendship is said in many ways, right? Yeah. And we might get into whether or not there's a precise sense that he means, right? The one that is the best friendship or the most friendship. Yeah, sure.
Like Aristotle says everything is said in
He does, and then he proceeds to kind of winnow down the ones that are silly and says like, yeah, but not that one, not that one. Sometimes he leaves it as like, yeah, genuinely is said in many ways, but it's rarely a cop-out. When he does, kind of like what we say, like why is said in many ways, or cause, aitia is said in many ways, exactly 4 ways. The formal cause, the material cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. And these are all part of the same account of the thing, right? That they're all kind of like codependent on one another. So sometimes he means things are said in many ways in that way. Sometimes he means things are said in many ways, and some of them are less precise than others. He'll sometimes talk about something being a blank in name only. Like he talks about a corpse being a body in name only. He says it's not a real body anymore because it doesn't have the form. It doesn't have the form of the living body because bodies are living things. Now it's just a pile of flesh and bones. We call it a body out of habit because we've been calling it a body up until that moment 10 minutes ago when it died. It's a body in name only. Chop off a hand. It's a hand in name only. Perhaps there are friends who are friends in name only, or friendships that are friendships in name only. Yeah, Andrew.
So are you saying then that there's sort of a dependency between all the virtues on each other?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, all of the virtues depend on one another, and it's an all or nothing affair. You can be close, you can be on your way. And in fact, when I was talking before about like the closer you get to virtue, the further along you are on this path to virtue, the more discerning your eye gets. Part of this has to do with recognizing when like your failings with respect to one virtue are really because of failings with respect to another virtue. And you're trying to align these two things. Some of the most difficult moments about trying to figure out how to be a good friend could be answered if part of our answer was like, yeah, but how do I be a courageous friend? How do I be a temperate friend? How do I be an honest friend? How do I be a generous friend? How do I be a gentle friend? How do I like all of the virtues that are virtues of character? They're all going to play into what being a good friend is like. They're all going to play into what being just is like as well. Aristotle says justice is, at the level of the individual, its whole virtue. And Plato kind of did this too. He said it's this balancing of the 3 parts of the soul. That this is one way to talk about justice. We can also talk about justice at the level of the city. And when Plato gives the city-soul analogy in Republic, the city also has 3 parts, and they need to be brought into balance with one another. One can't be kind of like outstrip its proper role. And the ruling part of the soul is always reason. The ruling part of the city is the reasonable part of the city. That's the ruler, hopefully, in a good government. Yeah, Andrew.
So then can you get into like this sort of failing circle where you're failing with respect to one virtue because you're failing with respect to another, which is in respect to another, and possibly you can get back to that because of failing in respect to the first.
You could, I suppose, yeah. This could be one of those things where you're kind of trying to adjust all around and like adjusting over here, put something out of whack over here, but you can slowly tune the whole thing up. You could also untune the whole thing in the same way. If we have a virtue holism, we're going to end up with a vice holism too. That you can't be truly vicious with a capital V unless you are completely like just riddled with vice through and through. This is before when I was saying that the vicious person for Aristotle seems like this picture of pity more than contempt. The vicious person is like barely alive. We get this other picture in Republic 2 from Plato about like people who have like some virtues, but some virtues that are very well developed and some vices that are very well developed. Those are very dangerous people. Those are the ones that are like skilled in the ways of kind of navigating the world with like a couple of things turned upside down. These are evil geniuses, right? Or the like. Folks who are very, very capable, but we don't know which direction they're oriented in, and perhaps it's the wrong direction. Book 6, we get into intellectual virtue. That's a trip. If you were interested in the stuff that happened in Book 3 on the soul, you might be interested in the stuff that happens in Book 6 of Nicomachean Ethics on intellectual virtue. We're not getting into it because, we got enough on our plate already. Book 7 is all about self-control specifically, not necessarily temperance, but they're close. 8 and 9 are about friendship, and the last one comes back to this question of pleasure and what's the relationship of pleasure to the good life. But we're talking about friendship today. How was that? That was 20 minutes, not too bad. Okay. We're talking about friendship today. Oh, there's another thing that I want to say about justice. When we, in addition to this idea that like virtue holism gets brought out in this conversation about justice, the conversation about justice in Book 5 of the Ethics, and the conversation about justice that happens in Aristotle's Politics, which we're not reading at all, brings up this kind of sense that maybe as a student of Plato's, you already kind of anticipated that Aristotle might be leaning in this direction. But he comes right out and says this in a way that I don't think we've really articulated this before. He says that humans are naturally social. Do we understand what he means when he says humans are naturally social? Good morning, everybody. Nature. That's a thing Aristotle talks about sometimes. We've discussed it in this class. What does it mean? Well, one of the things that it means is that it's unchangeable, right? If something is part of your nature, it can't be otherwise. Humans aren't naturally, which is to say they can't be otherwise, social. Now, MK, before class started, said she doesn't really care for very many people. They let her down. She'd be better off without them. And to that I said, in the Politics, Aristotle says somebody who doesn't need any other people is either less than a human, which is to say they don't need any people because like none of the things they're trying to do are those like kind of higher order human things that you need other people for. Like justice, for example. You can't have justice all by yourself. Can you have justice all by yourself? Can you have friendship all by yourself? This is a good thing. Can you be generous all by yourself? Can you be honest all by yourself? Maybe you can lie to yourself. There's like a difference between like being truthful or being dishonest to yourself. Although, I don't know if you do it intentionally when you lie to yourself. The other option for like not needing any other people is that you're greater than human. You have this kind of like amazing independence. You could be a god. So you're either a god or you're like a lesser beast if you say you don't need any other people. This is what Aristotle claims, not me. I agree with him. Does this seem right? William?
Well, he seems to define friendship in such a narrow way that one could argue that a good person could not be friends with anyone if he could not find a good person.
We'll get to that, yeah. That like, can you be friends with anybody who's like not already capital V virtuous? And it seems like he starts to kind of like edge towards like, well, we could call it a friendship. I don't know if it would be in the precise sense. Yeah. So there might be part of this is like, yeah, like other people, like, is it good to be around other people? Do you flourish around other people? We might say like, good people, yeah. Bad people, not so much. This might be the impulse that drives some of us to say that like, I don't need any other people. Why? Because the other people suck. They're worse than me and they bring me down. Which suggests, I suppose, a bit of a high opinion about oneself. But maybe it's well earned. Maybe it's well earned by the other people. Maybe it wasn't that I raised the bar. Maybe it was everybody else lowered it. Do we need other people in order to be what we are? In order to like be human, right? Because maybe you don't need other people to like stay alive. But do you need other people in order to flourish? Now, one of the ways that we can address this is we can address it through some kind of like physical anthropology sort of direction or biological anthropology and this question of like, what is it that makes us human? And we might say things like, well, we walk on 2 feet. We have language, which we only have because we have these gigantic brains. And the only way to have these gigantic brains are to, one, be born incredibly premature, because there's no way you're getting that like gigantic skull of yours out of your mother without killing her if you're not born premature. And then on top of being born premature, The vast majority of like your energetic resources in the first year of your life are going predominantly towards developing this brain, not helping you walk around or do any of those things that a gazelle could do like 5 minutes after it's born. That thing's ready to like kind of sort of make do. It's going to be easily caught by a cheetah for like a couple of days. But a gazelle is reasonably functional right out of the gate. Humans, crying pooping machines for at least a year, completely useless, can't take care of themselves. Which means somebody else needs to take care of them. Which means somebody else needs to be tending to the other things that the person who's caring for the child is doing. Which means now we need a society. Because it takes a village to raise a child. It's entirely possible to just say, like, there are no humans. Humans do not survive unless we're social. We could also take it to this higher level and say, like, yeah, maybe we could survive without being social. We certainly wouldn't flourish. Best way of being social, of course, is friends. Best kind of relationship with another person is a friendship. Does that seem about right? He opens up book 8 with this pay-in to friendship. He's like, it's the best of... Notice this, too, that what he says about friendship. One of the reasons why friendship gets its own special treatment is that it's not like any of the other virtues. In fact, I think we might hesitate to call friendship a virtue itself. Friendliness might be a character trait that makes you a good person, that allows you to flourish. But one of the reasons why friendship might not be considered a moral virtue is because it's an external good. Friendship is an external good. Not only is it an external good, but it's the best. It's the best of all the external goods. This is significant because none of the other virtues are external. They're all internal, right? They're all like character traits that you develop for your own soul. External goods are things that are not entirely within your control. For example, one of the reasons why you might not have good friendships is because they're, like as William was suggesting, perhaps as MK was alluding to before class started as well, maybe one of the reasons why you don't have too many friends, it's not your fault, it's not like you're not friendly enough. It's just like there aren't any people around you that are worthy of friendship. And if that's out of your control, well, that's going to be a whole lot different than virtue, because we just got done looking at book 3 where he says virtue seems to at least be totally within your control. What do you guys end up saying about that in your writing prompts, by the way? Is virtue within your control? You're responsible for whether you're virtuous or not? Yes, yes, no. Oh, okay. All right, good. Good that there's at least a diversity of opinions. Or maybe, not good. Maybe that's just like the way it's going to be because nobody has any control over any of this. But okay, all right, sure. The best of all the external goods. It's different than virtue because you don't have complete control over it. It takes two to tango, right? Not only is it the best of all the external goods, it is necessary for eudaimonia. Can't have human flourishing without friendship. Maybe can't have human flourishing without friendship. Have I sold you yet? No, not yet. He notes some surprising things about this. One thing that he'll say is that, like, you could have all of the things that there are to have in the world, but if you don't have friends to share it with, what good is it? Does that seem about right? Does that seem about right?
I don't think it's not good at all. I think
It's less good? Less good than the best good? There's a lot of room underneath the best, right? That's like everything else. What would be the best good? The best external good? Money? Is money better than friends? This is the sort of thing we could poll people on, right? And say, how many friends do you have? How many monies do you have? How happy are you? What do you think people self-report on this? Are they happier without money and with friends, or with money and without friends? And is their self-reporting reliable?
I think you need both to be happy.
You need both to be happy? You don't need both to be happy if your friends have money. That might be one of the reasons why it's good to have friends, is that like friends help you get shit done. Money also helps you get shit done, But like friends help you get shit done in a friendlier way, I suppose. You can't really be... Can you be friends with your money? After all, friendship seems to be some kind of species of pleasure. It's like philia, right? It's one of many kinds of philia. Can you be friends with your money? Aristotle takes this up. He doesn't say money. He says, can you be friends with wine? Wine. The beverage. Can you be friends with wine? Aristotle suggests that this is difficult to do for a couple of reasons. One, wine doesn't love you back. And it seems like friendships require some sort of reciprocity. This is perhaps the same reason why you can't really be friends with Kanye West. Maybe you can't be friends with Kanye West for a variety of reasons. But you can't be friends with a famous person who has no idea you exist. Similarly, wine and money don't know that you exist. And the other thing that Aristotle says about this is you can't wish wine well for its own sake. You can hope that the wine doesn't spoil so that you can drink it later. But you can't wish the wine well so that the wine can be its best for its own sake. And this seems to be necessary for friendships too. Maybe. He telegraphs a couple of these things, right? In that early moves where he's talking about like, does friendship need to be reciprocal? Can you be friends with inanimate objects like wine or money? He seems to telegraph a couple of things that he then kind of like leaves hanging and we'll try to sort out later. For example, can a friendship be based on utility, on something useful, on something instrumental? Yeah, William.
He talks about some power dynamics in this as well. And
yeah, so let's get these. Let me see. Do I have a? Before we get to that, we have something else to talk about. But yeah, eventually he gets it down to 3 kinds of friendships, right? Or 3 ways that friendship is said. Now, some people can say I'm friends with this jug of wine, but that Aristotle will say like, let's not even dignify that with like numbering it amongst the ways that friendship is plausibly said. Sorry, all of you who claim to be friends with wine. You have a way better relationship with wine than like I can imagine, or you have a way more impoverished sense of friendship than perhaps you can imagine. But before we get into those 3 different kinds of friendship, he asks another question that kind of structures the whole rest of Book 8 at least. And it's this question of, well, since we're talking about all the various ways in which friendship is said, we can look to the sayings about friendship. And people will say at least these 2 things about friendship, and they say them seemingly equally often, and you've probably heard some of these things as well. Sometimes folks will say, this is the thing about folksy wisdom too, for every good saying you can find a equally plausible saying that says the opposite thing. So sometimes folks will say, birds of a feather flock together. This is such a famous saying that it was like, it's exactly this way in ancient Greek. Like Aristotle says it exactly this way, and my guess is we've heard this before in English as well, right? Birds of a feather flock together, which is to say, like attracts like. Friends are people who are similar. But then he says, either the same people or different people will come back around, and they'll say things like opposites attract when it comes to friendship. Clearly, these can't both be true. So which is it?
that isn't necessarily facts. They could both be true.
They could both be true, that friendships are built on similarity and they're also built on difference? You need a good mix of both. Perhaps a mean with respect to 2 extremes. You could be too similar to your friends. You could be too different from your friends. What do you look for in a friend? Somebody who's like you? Do you look for things in friends? Do you intentionally cultivate your friendships? Mariana, you had your hand up.
I was going to say, like, look for someone who makes you better. Like,
You're looking for somebody who makes you better.
yeah, like something like they have something that you lack.
They have something that you lack. Like money, perhaps.
Or you make good use of it. Like, for instance,
Access? Maybe? They're a bouncer at that club that you've been trying to get into, but you can't get into. They have something that you could find useful. Their dad's connected. You could get a job at their dad's firm when you graduate. This is a good reason to be friends with someone. Maybe this isn't what you meant, but this is the first of the types of friendship that Aristotle talks about, the ways that friendship gets talked about. He says, we have what we might call useful, and we might call instrumental friendships. That is to say, friendships that are built on something that the friends get from one another. Yeah.
I feel like when Aristotle, numbers them and he goes for the first one, it kind of feels like he's talking more about a coworker or a colleague.
Yeah, perhaps, right? That a coworker or a colleague is somebody that you find useful, but that's it. Like, you're not going to be like friends with them on a deeper level. I had a boss say this to me once. I had a boss tell me that, like, yeah, you shouldn't really be friends with your coworkers because, like, you got to keep it professional. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what a dick. Because I've been friends with my colleagues before, and we did awesome stuff together. Not just, like, on the weekends, in the office. Yeah.
But, okay, so if it's just instrumental, like, or useful, then to what extent, like, you only talk to these people when you need something? Or
So this is one of the things that, yeah.
Play into it a little bit, and, like, I mean, are you pretending to, like, care when you talk to them about something? Like for me to talk to you, I'm like a normal, like a social interaction, be like, how are you? Like,
Yeah.
do I care? Or since you're just useful to me, am I waiting for you to shut up so I can ask you something?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which, like, if that's the case, that can totally be a relationship between people, right? Like, lots of our relationships are like those. Are those friendships? People call them friendships. Is it a friendship in the precise sense, as Thrasymachus would say? Is that a real friendship? Is that a good friendship? Maybe that's another way to think. Is that the best kind of friendship?
So is that kind of like saying that all companionships are kind of like friendships?
They could be called friendships. I mean, then again, like, we could say that you're friends with wine, I suppose. Like, Aristotle is not going to stop somebody from, like, talking a certain way. He just will sometimes be like, let's be clear, you're talking this way, the rest of us are talking this way. That if you're going to say, if this is the extent of, like, your sense of friendship, and perhaps, like we said before, with respect to, like, when we were looking at these various virtue and vice pairs, I was talking about how, like, just having the vocabulary for these things seems to be useful. To be able to, like, make these distinctions, almost like the way that, like, we talk about some cultures having many, many distinctions for things that we don't discriminate about, like how many different kinds of snow there might be. Maybe it's useful to make discriminations between kinds of friendships. Maybe, like, being able to be a good friend, being a flourishing person, being a person of good character, means, like, understanding the distinctions between different kinds of friendships or different kinds of relationships with people. Either way, it seems like one thing that we can say about, like, the useful or the instrumental friendships, as we were pointing out just a second ago, is that, like, what happens when you get what you needed from them? Or what happens when they no longer have what you needed from them? Then it seems like the whole purpose of the friendship is gone and the friendship dissolves. Now, this isn't like, you'll get later into, like, this question of, like, when should friendships be dissolved? Should they ever be dissolved? And he seems to say that, like, yes, sometimes friendships should be dissolved, but these seem like really, really fragile friendships. They don't stick around for very long. They stick around as long as the usefulness sticks around. And as soon as the usefulness is gone, so is the friendship. And Aristotle seems to be of the opinion, and I think I would agree with him, that, like, friendship, like real friendships, should be a little bit more robust. They should be the sorts of things that can weather a storm, like, I ran out of money. I don't have any money today. Oh, well, see you later, asshole. Like, a friend would stick by you when, like, shit's going wrong, right? When you no longer have, like, all of these resources to help out your friends, now you're the one who needs the help. If you had a friend who was only around when you were, like, flush with money and doing well, and as soon as things got hard, they, like, went away. And we're like, sorry, like, I can't deal with your drama. Are they a friend? I can't tell if, like, the staring into space that I'm seeing throughout the room, is it like, are we engaged and thinking and we don't know what to say? Are we just kind of like, friendship, fuck it, who cares? Like, we may as well be talking, like, go back to the metaphysics stuff that was way more interesting. Yeah.
If I'm the only one of my like if I'm friends with someone and I'm the one who has like money, right?
Yeah.
And they don't have any money, and our friendship, they have something else that I use them for, right?
Like weed.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. All right.
So if I run out of money, and then he doesn't want to hang out with me, then he's not an asshole for not wanting to hang out with me because like I can't buy weed from you if I don't have any money. So
That's right.
Hang out with me.
And that would be a business associate
Yeah, that's more like
and not a friend. Or
I mean,
they would be a friend, perhaps, like you could say it. But is it the thickest sense of the word?
like not in that.
that you really mean coworker when you
Yeah.
say
I have this discussion with my wife frequently, and I think this might be a cultural thing, because she comes from this kind of like German tradition of like, friend is a word that you reserve for very special occasions. And I'm always kind of like, yeah, friends are kind of like the more the better, right? And Aristotle, he takes this up in Book 9. He's like, how many friends should you have? And the answer, unsurprisingly, is like, not too many and not too few, right? Just the right amount, the virtuous mean. And like, I think everybody can like buy into that, right? Not too many and not too few. If it's too many, you can't really be a good friend to all of them. You just don't have enough like emotional resources to be a good friend to all of the people. Some of you may try to be friends with too many people, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're just stretched way too thin. And you're like, I can't be friends with this many people. It just takes too much out of me. Then again, if you're friends with too few people, it seems like you're kind of closing yourself off, right? More friends is probably, if friends are good, then presumably more friends are better until it starts to give you diminishing returns, perhaps. Now we're thinking of friendships as useful, right? Diminishing returns. Nice economic terms for friendships. Yeah, Joaquin. If there are no amount of friends that would be satisfactory, you have an insatiable desire for friends? It seems like you might have a temperance problem then. Yeah. Like it could be the same way that like somebody might say like I have an insatiable desire for cake or sex or heroin. Like these are the sorts of things that like, well, obviously there's too much, certainly for Aristotle, there's always too much of a good thing, except for virtue. There can't be too much virtue because it's the balance. You can't be too balanced. Too far to the right, too far to the left, but not too balanced. But any of the things that we could say like are potentially good, most of them are also potentially spoilable, right? Yes?
Is there a sense then that this might not just be referring to coworkers, the relationship of that nature? Because I kind of got the impression of like maybe,
Well, that's certainly one of the sorts of associations that we can have, right? And it's one, maybe not coworkers, but like business associates might be the right word. Folks who we do commerce with, this is like a clear sense in which like the relationship that we establish, the relationship that I have with my mechanic is one of usefulness and instrumentality. Like, I don't know her well enough to actually care in any sort of interesting way about her life and well-being. I know that she can fix my car. And I know, and she knows that like she can pay her mortgage by fixing my car because I'll give her money. But she doesn't know what's going on in my life. We don't have that deep of a sort of association with one another. This might be another way that we can talk about like whether or not like you can really count yourself as friends with somebody. Do you actually spend any time with them? Have you gotten to know them? This is perhaps one of the reasons why you can't be friends with Kanye either. Is that like you've not spent any time together. This is one of the things that friends do. They spend time together. And business associates are people that like we pass like ships in the night. We exchange out of like mutual usefulness. We exchange with one another. And then as soon as that exchange is over, we can part ways. It might be one that's set up for a long time. It might be the people who come and like, I don't know, spray for mosquitoes around my house, where it's not just one encounter, it's many. And if I see them enough times, I might be like, hey, how are your kids? And we might get to know each other. We might develop a real friendship. But it would have to go beyond that usefulness or instrumentality.
I'll let you know if it could be expressed in some other analogous sense rather than just strictly those of a business.
Another way that we might kind of cash it out is in a political sense. We might say, and Aristotle kind of anticipates the modern social contract theory, and he says, some people think that politically people come together out of mutual gain and usefulness. And Aristotle says, in that case, then citizens are not really, they're like friends in this sense, but not any of the thicker ones with one another. And at the very, very beginning, chapter 1 of book 8, one of the things that he mentions is kind of like Rousseauian point, and Rousseau won't be born for like 2,000 years, but like a Rousseauian point where he says, if people are friends, you don't even really need justice. Does that make sense? If all the people in a society were friends, really friends, yeah, then like you wouldn't need like the law to get them to act right. They would act well towards one another of their own accord. It would flow naturally from them. It would be the virtuous way of doing it, right? The virtuous way of being a citizen. Rousseau says a similar sort of thing, this idea that like it requires a psychological transformation to become a citizen. One that's kind of similar to like being friends with your fellow citizens, or at least having that sort of regard for their welfare. Not just out of usefulness for yourself. He says that's a thin way of making a society. Now, maybe this also gets into questions we said before. How many friends should you have? How many people can you have in a legit society where like everybody's friends with one another? Most of the social psychologists say something like you can't actually really know more than, 200 people at a time? Yeah, you just don't have the cognitive wherewithal for it. Let's go. William, you've had your hand up for a little while, then Zach, and then Victor.
So I think according to Aristotle's definition, you actually can be friends with Kanye.
Ah!
Because on his side, it is the useful instrumental friendship, as in he's getting money from you buying his album. On your side, though, it may be a little more involved than that.
Yeah, maybe I love something
like
else. This is
you're getting more than just like a simple transactional benefit from it. So he knows that you exist, he just doesn't know who you are. In much the same way that like a king can be friends with his subjects.
Yeah.
Even if he doesn't know every subject individually, he can still provide a benefit for them and they provide a benefit.
Sure. This starts to get into unequal friendships,
Yeah.
which is the second category. And one of the ways that we might talk about an unequal friendship is like one friend is in it for instrumentality and the other friend is in it for something else. Does that sound like a good friendship? An example of an unequal friendship where, well, Aristotle doesn't actually start. Let's start with the simpler examples of unequal friendships, and then we'll move on to this other one. This occurred to me this morning while I was walking my dog, too, and I was thinking to myself, like, he doesn't really talk about that one. The one where it's like, it's mixed because there are, like, mixed intentions on either side of the friendship. My suspicion is that those are going to be delicate friendships because, in my experience, when somebody finds out that like the only reason you were friends with them was because of their usefulness and they thought that the friendship was deeper, those friendships, there are hurt feelings and those friendships kind of end. Or those kinds of associations. Most of my experience with this, if we're looking for, who was it that asked for examples? Most of, this is getting too autobiographical. My grandparents watch these sometimes. Most of my experience with this involved like romances, where one person thought of the association as one of usefulness, and the other person thought that it was something deeper. And then as soon as that like became clear, there was no way that the friendship could continue. Some people are like, oh, you have no idea which side of that I was on. The third category, by the way, just in case, just so we can kind of like jump ahead like a bunch of little bunnies, the third category is friendships between equals. Friendships between equals, and there are at least two species of these friendships between equals that like come to mind. Probably, obviously more. But you could have friendships between equals where the people are like equal with respect to virtue. They're both virtuous people. This certainly seems like a pretty kick-ass friendship. And you could also have friendships between two equally vicious people. That seems like it may very well be a terrible friendship. Does that seem about right?
I don't know, you're both like horrible people.
If you're both horrible people, will you get along together?
Actually, he talks about this. He talks about how they can feed off each other's negative desires for the negative.
To become more and more vicious. The same way that, like, friends on their way to virtue will kind of, like, pull each other up and kind of, like, mutually help each other to virtue, which is a kind of usefulness, but it seems like it's a different kind of usefulness, perhaps. Either way, I don't know, like, particularly if we were saying, like, the truly vicious, capital V vicious person is almost dead. Like, I don't know. Can two people who are liars be friends with one another? And I'm not talking about, like, they always say the opposite of what's true and you can kind of decode it because it's like opposite day or some shit like that. Like, I just mean, like, sometimes they tell the truth and sometimes they don't. Can those two people be friends?
Didn't we already say that everyone sometimes tells the truth and sometimes doesn't? Like, it's...
The virtuous person sometimes tells the truth and sometimes shuts their mouth. But that's not the same as sometimes lies.
Yes, two liars can be friends.
Two liars can be friends?
90% of people lie. Everyone lies at some point.
Maybe being a liar is, like, stronger than you've told a lie. Does that seem plausible enough? Especially if being a liar is a character trait, some way that you've developed your soul that gives you a propensity to act such that you will lie. Yeah.
I think there are levels of lying, and one of the furthest levels of it is if you lie to your friends. So it depends on whether you've crossed that threshold or not.
And if you do lie to your friends, you're probably a liar. Like, I'm not sure how many lies you got to tell to be a liar. Just like I'm not sure how many bricks you got to lay to be a bricklayer. But I do know that if you lie to your friend, I do know that if you built 10 buildings out of bricks, you're a bricklayer. And if you lie to your friends, you're a liar. Some of you might be thinking to yourselves like, oh shit, I lie to my friends. But they're noble lies. They're like, does my butt look big in these? And you're like, no, of course not.
If you're a real friend, you'd say yes.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. If you were a real friend, you'd tell the hard truths. You'd do it tactfully, right? You wouldn't be like, no, the jeans don't make your ass look fat. Your fat ass makes your ass look fat. Like, that's what it is. You'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There was a gentler and friendlier and more tactful way to tell that truth. And so, like, no, that was not honesty. You erred to the side of tactlessness, of telling truths in unnecessarily brutal ways. Is he a Kantian? Oh, goodness. He's not a Kantian because the reason that he's going to give is completely different. But I don't know. Ask yourself, like, you know, what would virtuous man do, right? Or virtuous woman do? What would Jesus do? What would, you know, whoever your hero is, right? Especially with, you might have to break your heroes up into, like, different kinds of virtues. Like, I've got this hero for courage. I've got this hero for honesty. Whoever your hero for honesty is, do they lie sometimes? Or do they just know when to keep their mouth shut? That's a tough call. I'm not sure how to parse that one. Unequal friendships. That's where we were. I don't mind, like, spinning off into, like, other things on this topic. It's like there's plenty to explore and it's lots of fun. Also, Zach and Victor had their hands up and I never got to them. So let's start with Zach and then I guess we'll get around to William. But everybody know we got to come back to talk about unequal friendships. That's, like, the next thing. Yeah. Zach.
How would you categorize friendships between other members of society?
How would I characterize? Can I start with how Aristotle would characterize them?
Yes.
Aristotle would characterize relationships between members of, like, two different species. Are you thinking specifically of humans and non-human animals? Yeah, okay. Between humans and non-human animals, these are unequal friendships. In terms of, like, the two things involved in the friendship are not equal to one another. And not just different, like, there's a value to the inequality. This is typically what he means, too, when he talks about friendships between unequals. This is as good a time as any to, like, launch into the thing I was going to say. The examples that he gives are things like parents and children. Where, like, it's not just that parents and children are different. Like, the parents are superior to the child. Buying it? With respect to human flourishing and character. If you doubt this, scale it back a little bit. Maybe you're thinking of too old of a child. a 2-year-old. Are the parents superior to the 2-year-old? They can take him in a fight. They can talk better than them. They're better friends. 2-year-olds are terrible friends. Can we all agree with this? Louis C.K. used to, made a whole career out of this, out of talking about his kids as if they were adults and kind of revealing that, little kids are assholes. People are like, oh, they're so pure and innocent. Bullshit. Little kids are terrible. If an adult acted the way that a small child did, we would not hesitate for a moment to call him an asshole. If you had a friend, this is literally the Louis C.K. bit, if you had a friend, you guys were all going to go out to dinner, and you had a friend who, you guys couldn't leave because they wouldn't put on their shoes. And you were like, well, why don't you want to put on your shoes? And they're like, I don't want to. If that was, your adult friend, you'd be like, well, fuck that guy. But because it's a kid, we kind of, we grant them leniency. We don't think they're an asshole. We just think they're undeveloped. They're inferior to an adult. And perhaps we would say the same thing. And Aristotle is not shy about this. That, non-human animals don't have the capacity for reason. And for that reason, the relationship between a human and a non-human is never going to be a friendship between equals. I can always intercede on behalf of, say, my dog, who I would say is a pretty good candidate for a friend for me. When I think about my dog, I do try to think about it in terms of friendship. But I do have to also put an asterisk by this because, I make decisions for my dog in ways that I don't make decisions for my friends. I have no problem stepping in and saying, this is for your own good. You don't get to decide. Whereas with a friendship, that's a little bit weirder and different. With parent-child relationships, that certainly seems to be the case too. Parents make decisions for the children because they have a better sense of what's good for the child than the child does for themselves. Certainly at a very young age. As you get older, you start to get a little bit more independent. Right about where you are now, my guess is you're no, we're equals. My parents don't know better than me. Give it a couple years. They've certainly got more experience than you do. They've got more money than you do. Even now, do you take more from your parents than you give back? That's a relationship between unequals. We've seen this before, too, in Euthyphro. So it's not just parent-child, it's teacher-student. This is why we open with, can we be friends? Can you and I be friends? Perhaps one of the reasons why we're not going to be capital F friends is because the relationship is one primarily of usefulness, at least on one side of this equation. You want a grade out of this interaction, and that's pretty much all that you want. If that's all, then that puts a ceiling on what kind of friendship this can be. I'm not sure exactly what I want from you. I'd like to see you think. I don't know if it's useful or instrumental to me. Yeah. Yeah, perhaps. Nicole. Yeah, and Aristotle does say this. He says, one of the things that we can say about unequal friendships is that, depending on how they go, they can become relationships between equals, and parent-child relationships are a great example of this. Yeah, over time, if done well, the two become equal. We can also imagine, a friendship where, between unequals where they become equal, where one person is, a bad influence on the other, and they bring them down, and they can become equal that way. Well, that one's not quite as good. Victor, you had your hand up a while ago. Is it the comment still good?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
So for the first one, I guess we were talking about material usefulness a lot.
Yeah.
Did you factor in emotional usefulness?
Well, Aristotle does mention, in addition to usefulness, he talks about friendships based on pleasant feelings. You just like being around them. And he says that's pretty much the same as usefulness, right? You're getting good feelings out of them. But there's this other kind of usefulness that seems to be bouncing around, which is useful in pursuit of virtue. They make me a better person. Which is a kind of instrumentality, but it seems perhaps a little bit different. Specifically, I think maybe because I can imagine friendships where we're both in it because we think the other makes us a better person. And those don't seem to be as fragile as these useful or instrumental relationships can be. They seem to be a whole lot more robust. They're not as likely to break down. Now, friendships can break down. One of the reasons why they might break down is you might look at your friend and you might say something like, I'm not getting anything out of this friendship at all. It's not just you're temporarily going through tough times and I don't get the benefits of being your friend for now, and so I don't care now. It's that I've given you the bit, you were on hard times and I was there for you and I was helping you out, but it seems like you never really get your shit together. And I'm always giving and giving and giving and not really getting anything back at all. And it's not even there's a parent-child relationship here. It's not a proper relationship between unequals. Because I feel maybe it is it's one of those bad relationships between unequals. You're making me worse. You're a toxic presence in my life. Cut that person off. For sure, right? Should you? Or should you stick by him even then?
They have potential to be useful later.
This is what it comes down to for Aristotle, right? He says, if they're fixable, a friend will stay in there and try to get things right again. If they're not fixable, it seems like the prudent thing to do is to cut them loose. That's a tough thing, right? Have you ever had to do this, by the way? Have you ever had to cut a friend loose because it was just kind of boy, once upon a time you were a good person. Now you just don't really seem like a good person. I can't stand by. I don't know about you. I have tons and tons of friends who come to me with their bullshit drama, and they're just things suck because X, Y, and Z. And I'm X, Y, and Z are all changeable. Here's how you change them. This is maybe not what friends want when they come to you to complain, by the way, is to explain how they can solve their problems. I've been told this by my wife as well. But there are only so many times that somebody can come to me with a complaint about something that they can fix without fixing it before I'm just kind of I don't get why I should care anymore. I don't get why I should care that your life sucks because you refuse to fix it. I can't fix it for you. Yeah, Kate.
What if someone that is fixable, right? If that person is fixable, but you just can't fix it, right?
Oh.
Someone else would be able to make you feel better and fix the response, but I just can't do it.
Yeah, I can't be the one who does it. Then maybe you help them find the one who can. I can't literally do it, but I can put you in touch with the person who can. In that case, I'm helping to fix you, I suppose. I'm still staying in there for the friendship. Or I might have to make reasonable boundaries where I'll say, until you sober up, buddy. Until you get clean. We're not going to associate. When you do, come back and, we'll be friends again. But, I can't be friends with, addict you. I can only be friends with clean you. We might say it like that, yeah.
But that kind of also feels like a useful friendship. Kind of
Your
Your pancreas just fell out. I can't fix that, but let me help you to a doctor who can stuff your pancreas.
In which case, you're going to, your value as a friend to them is your usefulness. You maybe can't put the pancreas back in, but you can find the person who can. Because without a pancreas, you can't really browse the web so well. You're on the floor, right? Yeah, maybe. But this is maybe an interesting thing to kind of bring back around as we're kind of marching down this to the friendships between equals, specifically friendships between virtuous people or people who seem to be on their way to virtue. We start to get this sense that friends are useful and friends are pleasant. A friendship based on nothing but pleasure and usefulness is a thin kind of friendship. But a real friendship is useful and it is pleasant. You're not supposed to hate your friends. That's not a good friendship. You delight in their presence, right? And you delight in their presence because there's something about their presence, there's something about them that's lovable. When we ask this thing what do you love when you love a friend? Eventually, it seems when Aristotle's talking about the sorts of friendships that are between equals, specifically virtuous equals, the thing that you love for this sort of friendship, for the best kind of friendship, the thing that you love in your friend is the good. You see them as a reflection of the good. It starts to get into kind of early Christian agape type stuff, too. You can see where they're kind of drawing on the Greeks from this.
Example with the junkie or whatever, if you had a friend that changes and you decide no longer be friends with them, is it that the fact that they are a completely different person, you were not Is junkie Al a completely different person from regular Al?
Well, you had
Like in the fact that
yeah.
Socrates awake and
Socrates asleep, or like, are they the same person? That gets deep into some like theory of identity stuff, which, to be honest, I'm not sure where Aristotle stands on those questions. Like, I think I'd know where to look for those things, but yeah, they don't come readily to mind. They're in the deep, dark, unexplored, for me, unexplored corners of On the Soul, I think. That's like where we're going to find that sort of stuff. I think he'd say they're the same thing. They're the same ousia. They're the same substance. I don't know if they're the same person. This is also a different thing because like the Greeks don't really have a very sophisticated notion of personhood. That's not going to be developed until the modern era. Yeah. So we might be asking for the answer in terms that are just not available here. Good question.
In the parental relationship of greater or lesser friendship, isn't the definition that ties those together love? And isn't he making the point that to be a virtuous friendship, love has to be the binding characteristic?
Yeah, perhaps. And I think also then, like, one of the things that might happen here is we maybe just bounced the problem someplace else. Instead of trying to figure out, like, what's a real friendship like? We say, a real friendship is one that's built on love. And then we say, like, all right, so what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. What is love, then? Is it just, like, usefulness and pleasantness? Can you love wine? And we, no, not really. Like, does love have to be reciprocal? Does love mean that you care about the welfare of, like, your beloved for their own sake, not for your sake? It's almost as if when we come back to this sense in which, like, friendships are useful and they're pleasant, they're almost accidentally so. At one point, Aristotle asks, is it better to love or is it better to be loved? You guys remember what he said about this? Is it better to love? I almost put this as a quiz question. Is it better to love or is it better to be loved? What do you think Aristotle would say? Sean? Probably better to love than to be loved? Somebody say better to be loved? Aristotle does say better to love. And the reason that he gives is an interesting one. I don't know if it's like a great argument, but he says, when we look in relationships where like one person is more loved and one person is more beloved, for example, in relationships between unequals, like parent-child relationships, where the parent loves the child in a way that like the child doesn't really give back.
You think it's the same with your dog?
Yeah, I don't think my dog desires like my welfare for my own sake. I think my dog has warm affections towards me. I think it's a challenge to try to figure out what an interspecies friendship would look like. But it would be somehow, like in Aristotle's eyes, it would be a deficient friendship for precisely that reason. For this reason that like one gives more and one takes more. And in this sense, if we're trying to figure out which is superior, right? Is it better to love or better to be loved? He says, the better people love more than they're loved. And the worse people are more takers in these relationships, right? The better people are more givers in the relationship. The worse people are more takers in the relationship. At least in relationships where one gives more and one takes more, like friendships between unequals. So if the way that we're going to answer which is better is we look at what the better people do, and that doesn't seem like a crazy way of answering the question, then it's better to love than to be loved. There's another kind of like, we talked about unequal friendships that become equal. We've talked about equal relationships that become unequal because the person changes for the worse. Have we talked about equal relationships become unequal because one person gets better than the other person? Let's go back to the one where like one person gets worse. Have you ever had to do that? I think I asked that question. Some people nodded. Yeah, has like everybody had this experience where you had a friend who was like doing okay and then they started to do a whole lot worse. And like at some point like you had to seriously consider, and maybe you pulled the trigger on this, ending the friendship. What about those cases where ending the friendship, or at least ending the status of the friendship as between equals, means that you have to let your friend become better. And becoming better might be like not being with you anymore. Have you ever had to do that? We had a friend and like you knew what was going to like make their life better. Was something that was going to make your life worse. For example, maybe they went to like a different school. You didn't get into that school. They got into that school. You wanted that. They got into UNCG. You wanted to go to college together, and you wanted to like keep the friendship going. But at the same time, like or maybe it was like a relationship. You don't get to see them as much anymore, but they're happier in the relationship. Does a real friend let them go if it means that there's some expense to them? What's the right thing to do in that situation? There's a philosopher, somebody I'd count as a friend, too, a guy named Christopher Cahoon, has a really interesting paper on this. He talks about this as the divine wish, that every friend wishes that their friends, every real friend, capital F, like thick friend, wishes for their friends to like become a god, to no longer need them. Maybe this is like the attitude of parents towards children, too. What does every parent really want for their child? For their child not to need them anymore. That's a sad day for a parent. But a happy day too, I guess? Now, they're never going to literally be a god, right?
But if you are working towards getting your friends to a state where you avoid any need of friendship, and friends are good things, and you couldn't necessarily be living the best life you could because the good life involves good friends.
This is in the minutiae of the translations as to whether or not this is like literally we want them to become a god or we just want them to become virtuous, like as virtuous as they could be. Yeah. Now, one version of this is that you're going to become a god and you won't need any friends. The less exotic version of this, that doesn't involve like transfiguration into a different kind of being, would be one where we just say, like, in order to become the best you that you can be, you need to leave me behind. That's a little rarer than the, like, in order for me to become a better person, I need to leave you behind. I think a lot of us are more familiar with that. We also might think about this as, like, more necessary, more a part of being a good person. What about the opposite? What about being on the other end of that? Where in order to let somebody be their best, you have to let them go.
Well, you do that with your friends sometimes. I mean, not necessarily let them go, but like you let people make mistakes. Like when you uninvolve yourself and let someone else do something that you know might not. Like you remove yourself from the situation so that they can figure that out.
So they can fall on their face and then learn the lesson the most potent way. By making the mistake themselves. And then you come back and you're like, all right. But in order to do that, right, I need to maybe, and now I'm kind of like the one who knows what's best for you. I guess maybe I have to be that too if I'm saying like, yeah, you should just kind of leave me behind.
I think the reason that's rare is because it's expecting the less virtuous person in the friendship to be extremely virtuous in this aspect of knowing success.
It's rare because if they are the lower one, then they're probably not gonna like be virtuous enough to be like, I love you for your own sake. Go be free without me. And I'll shed a tear for like the things that I've lost. But I'm so much happier of all the things that like you'll have gained. That's not the lower person, that's the higher person that would do that. We might also say that like, yeah, but like really unlikely that the higher person wouldn't turn back around and be like, fuck this, not without my friend I'm not going on. Like I'm bringing my friends with me. Going back down into the cave. Right? I think those are all the things in my notes. Yeah, but there's a question still.
Are we leaving them behind because, are we like pushing that person away because of anything to do with
virtue.
Well, maybe the solution to this problem, one of the things that's weird about this is what Cahoon says, this friend and philosopher that I was talking about. One of the things that he says about this is this seems peculiar because it's this way that, like, in order for a friendship to succeed, the friendship needs to break itself. That's a weird sort of thing, right? That, like, in order for the friendship to, like, in order to do the real friendly thing, you need to break the friendship. And that seems a little peculiar. There aren't very many things that in order to, like, really be what they are, they have to destroy themselves. But one of the ways that we can get around this is we can say, like, yeah, but we don't actually, like, because friends are good, because they're this, like, unqualified good, we always bring our friends along with us. They're like that, like, we don't ever have these things in which, like, one friend pushes the other one ahead. Although that might happen. This might, like, come up from time to time. This is what super bad at the end of the day is all about. Yeah. Yeah. That's why I use the example of, like, one friend gets into one school. Yeah. All right. Friendship gives us a natural transition into the Epicureans. This is the last we'll talk of Aristotle. We'll be talking about the Epicureans at the next meeting. Keep eyes peeled for a reading and a reading quiz.